Reza Shah Pahlavi was born in 1878 in the Mazandaran province of northern Iran. His early life was one of poverty and obscurity, raised in a humble family with no ties to the ruling elite. From a young age, he was drawn to the military as a path out of hardship. Tall, imposing, and disciplined, he quickly rose through the ranks of the Persian Cossack Brigade, a Russian-trained unit that dominated Iran's military structure. His ambition, coupled with an unshakable sense of order and authority, set him apart from his peers. By the 1920s, Iran was a fractured state, plagued by weak Qajar rule, tribal uprisings, foreign interference, and deep corruption. Reza, a man of action rather than compromise, positioned himself as the strong hand the nation craved. In 1921, he staged a military coup that reshaped the country's trajectory. With little bloodshed, he marched into Tehran and seized control of the capital. Initially, he declared his loyalty to Ahmad Shah Qajar, the reigning monarch, but it became clear that Reza was the real power behind the throne. By 1925, through political maneuvering and sheer force of will, he abolished the Qajar dynasty and declared himself Shah of Iran, founding the Pahlavi dynasty. This moment marked the beginning of his mission to modernize, centralize, and transform Iran into a strong, independent state. Reza Shah was a visionary in some respects, inspired by the rapid modernization efforts of leaders like Mustafa Kemal Ataturk in Turkey. He sought to pull Iran out of centuries of stagnation and foreign domination. He restructured the military into a modern, national force, breaking the power of tribal leaders who had long undermined central authority. He introduced sweeping reforms, building railways and roads, strengthening industry, expanding secular education, and restricting the influence of the clergy. His passion for modernization was coupled with a fierce nationalism. He banned the wearing of traditional clothing such as the veil, renamed Persia to Iran in international forums, and promoted a revival of pre-Islamic Persian identity. Yet his rule was not one of soft reform but of iron discipline. He tolerated no dissent and demanded obedience from all. Political opponents were silenced, journalists censored, and activists imprisoned or exiled. His centralization policies alienated tribal leaders, religious clerics, and intellectuals alike. While he raised Iran's international standing, his heavy-handedness created resentment at home. Foreign relations were another defining aspect of his reign. Reza Shah resented British and Russian interference in Iranian affairs and sought to limit their grip. He attempted to assert independence by balancing relations with Germany, a move that would later prove disastrous. By the late 1930s, as the Second World War loomed, his growing ties with Nazi Germany alarmed both Britain and the Soviet Union, who saw him as a potential threat to their strategic interests in the Middle East. By the early 1940s, his once unchallenged authority began to waver under international pressure. In 1941, British and Soviet forces invaded Iran, citing the need to secure oil fields and supply routes. Reza Shah, the strongman who had built his rule on pride and power, was forced to abdicate in favor of his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Exiled to South Africa, he lived the remainder of his days in isolation, far from the empire he had sought to transform. He died in 1944, a man both celebrated for his achievements and criticized for his authoritarian methods. Reza Shah Pahlavi remains a towering yet polarizing figure in Iranian history. To some, he was the founder of modern Iran, the man who dragged his country into the 20th century with infrastructure, industry, and nationalism. To others, he was a dictator who ruled with an iron fist, disregarded traditions, and sowed the seeds of future unrest. His reign embodied both the promise of progress and the perils of authoritarianism, leaving a legacy that still shapes Iran to this day. Reza Shah Pahlavi's final years were marked by decline, betrayal, and exile. After years of absolute power, he had built a state that bore his name and image everywhere, yet when his throne was shaken, he found himself isolated. By the late 1930s, his attempts at modernization had created tensions across every layer of society. Traditionalists resented his forced secular reforms, the clergy saw him as hostile to religion, and the tribes resisted his brutal campaigns to centralize power. Yet what ultimately brought down his rule was not the voice of the Iranian people but the pressure of world powers. When World War II engulfed the globe, Iran's geography made it vital. Sitting between the oil fields of the Middle East and the Soviet frontier, Iran became a strategic bridge. Reza Shah had sought neutrality, yet he had also leaned toward Germany, admiring its discipline and military strength. Many German advisors and engineers worked in Iran, and the Allies feared this would give Hitler influence in the region. In 1941, Britain and the Soviet Union jointly invaded Iran, citing the threat of German presence. The mighty army Reza Shah had built, which he believed was a symbol of his strength, collapsed within days. His regime, which had been projected as unshakable, crumbled under foreign boots. The Allies forced him to abdicate in favor of his young son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Humiliated and stripped of his throne, Reza Shah boarded a train to exile. His departure was a scene of irony. The man who had ruled with iron fists, who had demanded obedience from millions, left his own country as a powerless figure. First exiled to Mauritius, then South Africa, he lived in increasing isolation, consumed by bitterness and regret. He often reflected on how he had modernized Iran, building railways, schools, factories, and armies, yet in his final days, he was remembered less for progress and more for tyranny. Reza Shah died in Johannesburg in 1944, far from the palaces he had once built and the throne he had once guarded so fiercely. His remains were eventually returned to Iran, buried first in a grand mausoleum, though even that did not remain untouched. After the Islamic Revolution of 1979, his tomb was destroyed by revolutionaries who despised the monarchy, leaving only fragments of stone where once stood a monument to his reign. The legacy of Reza Shah Pahlavi is complex and divided. To some, he was a modernizer who dragged Iran into the 20th century, introducing schools, universities, and infrastructure. To others, he was a ruthless dictator who crushed freedoms, humiliated opponents, and ruled through fear. His forced westernization alienated many Iranians, setting the stage for decades of political struggle that his son would inherit. In the end, Reza Shah's life was a portrait of power's fragility. He rose from the ranks of a soldier to the crown of a king, shaped his nation with unyielding force, and then lost it all to foreign hands. His story remains a reminder that absolute power, no matter how vast, can be reduced to exile and forgotten stones when the tides of history turn.